It is one of the most recognizable images ever captured. A sailor in a dark navy uniform, bending a woman in white backwards as he presses a sudden, triumphant kiss onto her lips in the middle of Times Square. Around them, crowds erupt in joy, strangers laugh and cry, confetti floats like snow, and New York City roars with the sound of victory. The year is 1945. The war that consumed the world is finally over. But behind that single frozen moment, behind the silhouette that became a symbol of peace, lies a story far deeper, far more human, and far more complicated than most people ever knew. This is the story of the kiss, the story of the sailor, the story of the woman in white, and the story of a photographer who captured history at exactly the right millisecond. On the morning of August 14th, 1945, New York City woke up tense. Rumors had been circling for days. Japan was negotiating surrender. The war might be ending. President Truman could speak at any moment. After 6 long years of bloodshed, millions of families waited for a single sentence that would change everything. By midday, Times Square was packed. People gathered around radios in storefront windows. Taxi drivers left their cabs in the streets. Office workers flooded out of buildings, craning their necks for any scrap of news. The city, usually loud and restless, now held a nervous silence. Then suddenly, sirens, bells, shouting, a burst of noise like an explosion of joy. At exactly 7:03 p.m., it became official. Japan surrendered. World War II was over. Times Square erupted. People screamed, cried, hugged strangers. Sailors climbed lampposts. Soldiers tossed their caps into the air. Bands appeared from nowhere. Fire trucks blared through the crowds. And the streets, those wide canyons of Manhattan, became the stage for one of the greatest celebrations in human history. It was in the middle of this chaos that a 21-year-old sailor ran through Times Square like a man tasting life for the first time. His name was George, a Navy sailor who had served in the Pacific. He had seen things no young man should ever see: burning ships, kamikaze attacks, friends lost at sea. The war carved deep lines into him, even though he was barely past 20. But that day, the day the war ended, he felt weightless. George had just left a bar near Times Square when he heard the news. The bartender turned up the radio, Truman's voice cracked through the static, and the entire room exploded into celebration. George didn't think. He ran. Out the door, down the street, into the heart of the eruption. He hugged men, women, anybody he saw. He lifted strangers into the air. He grabbed a bottle of something he couldn't remember and tossed it away. He felt alive, wildly, fiercely alive. But beneath the joy was something else, a darker memory, a memory of white uniforms, white dresses, white cloth, stained with blood. During the war, George had seen nurses work miracles on dying soldiers. He had watched them step into hell with nothing but bandages and determination. He adored them, admired them, maybe even worshipped them a little. To him, a woman in white symbolized salvation. So when he saw her, a woman in a pristine white dress standing in the middle of Times Square, his heart pulled him toward her, as if she were the embodiment of everything good he had ever seen. Her name was Greta, a 21-year-old dental assistant working at a nearby clinic. She was not a nurse, but that day she wore a crisp white dress that made strangers mistake her for one. Earlier that afternoon, she too had heard the news of victory. She stepped into Times Square and was swept away by the madness around her. People grabbed her hands, twirled her, embraced her. She didn't mind. It felt like the world had suddenly become one enormous beating heart. And then she saw him, a sailor, running toward her with outstretched arms. Before she could react, before she could move, George grabbed her, dipped her backward, and kissed her in the middle of the crowd. It was unexpected. It was sudden. It was overwhelming. But it was not frightening. Greta later said, "It wasn't a romantic kiss. It was a celebration." He was so happy the war was over. I felt the same. To her, the moment became a symbol not of passion, but of collective relief, the entire world exhaling at once. And that is when a man with a camera turned his head. His name was Alfred Eisenstaedt, a photographer for Life magazine. He had been darting through Times Square all day, capturing scenes of jubilation, children climbing traffic lights, sailors dancing, strangers cheering under ticker-tape snow. But then he saw them. A flash of white bent backward, a sailor's dark uniform sharp against the brightness, a pose that echoed both romance and triumph, unplanned, unpoised, utterly human. He didn't ask their names. He didn't shout instructions. He didn't adjust the lighting. He simply raised his Leica and clicked the shutter. In that millisecond, the lens captured the tilt of Greta's head, the force of George's embrace, the blur of people rushing by, the explosion of joy around them, a world being reborn. Eisenstaedt didn't know it yet, but he had just created one of the most iconic photographs in history. The next day, Life magazine published the photo. It spread across the United States like wildfire. People framed it, pinned it to their walls, cut it out, and tucked it into letters. Collectors saved it for decades. To many Americans and millions around the world, the photograph became the symbol of victory, a symbol of peace, a symbol of a future finally free of fear. But what made the photo unforgettable wasn't just the kiss. It was the emotion behind it. Two strangers meeting for the first and only time, creating a moment that captured the relief of an entire planet. For years, nobody truly knew who the sailor and the woman were. Hundreds of people claimed to be them. Veterans stepped forward saying, "That was me." Women insisted, "I was the one in white." Eisenstaedt himself didn't know. He never asked their names. He said, "I was so focused on the moment, I didn't want to miss the shot." For decades, the world had a photograph without identities. And maybe that was why it became so universal. It could represent anyone. But eventually, after countless interviews, studies, and investigations, researchers identified the most likely pair: George Mendonça, the sailor, Greta Zimmer-Friedman, the woman in white. And when they finally met again years later, they laughed at the memory. Two strangers forever bound by a single millisecond. Greta said, "I was just in the right place at the right time." George said, "I kissed her because I was so grateful for the nurses who saved us." And with that, the world finally had names for the faces behind the legend. Modern audiences sometimes discuss the photo through a different lens, asking whether it was appropriate to kiss a stranger. Greta herself addressed this many times. She said it wasn't romantic, it wasn't intimate, it wasn't even personal. It was an explosion of relief, a moment that couldn't have happened on any other day in history, a reaction born from the end of unimaginable horror. She said, "It wasn't my choice to be kissed, but it wasn't an assault, it was a celebration." Her perspective grounds the photograph in its historical context, a reminder that the emotions of war and peace do not fit neatly into modern definitions. It was, in her own words, pure joy, not between two people, but for the world. The Times Square kiss became more than a photograph. It became a painting, a postage stamp, a statue displayed in cities around the world, a symbol of the generation that sacrificed everything. Tourists visit Times Square every day, standing exactly where George and Greta once stood. Couples recreate the pose. Photographers imitate Eisenstadt's angle. The story lives on through every reenactment, every memory, every frame. But perhaps the true power of the photograph lies in this. It captured not just two people, but the emotional release of millions. Think of everything that came before that kiss. The battles, the fear, the telegrams mothers dreaded to receive, the empty chairs at dinner tables, the cities ruined, the lives stolen. And then, think of what came after: the rebuilding, the hope, the return of loved ones, the promise of peace, even if temporary, the first steps into a new world. The kiss is the line drawn between those two realities, a moment suspended between darkness and light. 80 years later, the image remains powerful, not because it is perfect, but because it is real, it is messy, unplanned, chaotic, human. It is a reminder that history is not just battles and dates, it is people, emotions, and split seconds that define entire eras. The Times Square kiss tells us that after the deepest suffering, the human spirit still reaches for joy. It tells us that peace is worth celebrating, that relief can be overwhelming, that strangers can share a moment that belongs to the whole world. And above all, it tells us that one photograph, taken in the blink of an eye, can carry the weight of a generation. In the end, the sailor and the woman went their separate ways, never becoming lovers, never meeting again until decades later for an interview, but their single, unexpected kiss became immortal. It lives on in museums, in history books, in the hearts of those who look at it and feel the echo of victory. And as long as people celebrate peace, as long as cameras capture the truth of human emotion, the kiss in Times Square will never be forgotten because it was more than a kiss. It was a world coming back to life.